Assassin's Creed Chronicles games are wasted games. That's not so much a comment on their quality as much as it's a comment on their very conception. They are short side-scroller spin-off games that tried to translate some of the design principles of the main games into a 2D format. That's not a terrible idea, in fact they're not even the first games in the series to do that. Assassin's Creed 1 and 2 both had handheld spin-offs that did the same things. One of them was even called Chronicles. The difference is that those were spin-off games, telling the continuing and, frankly, less interesting stories of Altair and Ezio, characters who'd already gotten the full spotlight treatment elsewhere. Whereas each of the 3 Chronicles titles takes us to places and characters of tremendous importance to the greater Assassin's Creed franchise, never before seen in the games, and proceeds to waste them on a series of experimental spin-offs that are ultimately not that great. Imperial China, the Anglo-Sikh Wars, and the Russian Revolution are each strong enough settings to carry a full 30-hour game with protagonists equally interesting to match them. But instead, we have Assassin's Creed Chronicles, the very last dregs of the middle era of Assassin's Creed. If you ask most people, there was no Assassin's Creed game released in 2016. After Syndicate failed to perform, the franchise took a year off for the first time in nearly a decade to make sure that the next game would be a proper revival of the franchise. But that's not technically true. There was 2 games that came out in 2016 called Assassin's Creed, along with a movie that we're just going to ignore. They weren't big mainline games, in fact they weren't even in the same genre, but they did come out, and more than that, they were console releases, not just handheld spin-off games, so why does everyone ignore them? Well, probably because no one has played them, and the people that have played them probably don't remember much about them. I am not here to tell you that the Assassin's Creed Chronicles games are some kind of hidden gem. They are, in fact, thoroughly average all around, but their existence is interesting. They are, if nothing else, bizarre little cultural artifacts. I mean, how many side-scrollers do you know that have you fight against the duplicitous Leon Trotsky? Probably not that many. So, it might seem like a waste of time, but I've got time to kill. So, without further ado, let's talk about the Assassin's Creed Chronicles.
The box is empty, or should I say, incomplete. Where is the rest of it? We know who you are. We know who you were. You've come far for someone who was merely once a concubine. I will ask you again, assassin. What is this box? Where did it come from, and what is its purpose?
Assassin's Creed Chronicles includes 3 separate games, but it's probably better to think of them as episodes like a Telltale game might have, rather than as fully distinct separate games. Each game plays pretty much identically, and despite all being set in vastly different times and places, each episode is connected by a few key plot threads. The first of these episodes is Chronicles China, which actually came out slightly before Assassin's Creed Syndicate as part of the Season Pass for Unity. This also makes it the most high profile of the 3 Chronicles games because everyone who bought Unity got it for free as part of the Apology Tour. It stars Xiao Jun and the reign of the 8 Tigers during the Ming Dynasty period. This establishes an important factor in the Chronicles games right away, which is that none of the protagonists of these games are actually new to the franchise. Rather, they are in all 3 cases the debut of an important extended media character into an actual game. Xiao Jun first appeared in Ezio's epilogue short film, Embers, where most of her story in this game was initially set up. She's also, within the lore of Assassin's Creed, one of the most important and influential assassins in history, up there with Altair and Ezio in terms of accomplishments and legacy, which makes her only game appearance being a 3-hour side-scrolling spin-off extremely weird. She's the inventor of several assassin tools like the rope dart that Connor uses, and she rebuilt the entire Chinese Brotherhood from the ground up by herself because she was the last surviving Chinese assassin after a great purge. That's the story they're trying to tell in a 3-hour window. It's a bit rushed, as you may guess. But I'm coming out of the gate a bit strong here because the Chronicles games are not completely without merit. In fact, you're seeing the game's biggest strength right now, which is its striking and honestly excellent art direction. Rather than aim for realism, the Chronicles games lean heavily into abstracts and artistry that reflects the era they're set in. For Chronicles China, that means traditional Chinese ink wash painting. The game has a bold use of colours, mostly blacks and dark browns, with the only pop of colour being the red in Xiao Jun's outfit or the pops of blood when you kill an enemy. And everything is rendered with a painted brushstroke style, and all the effects come in with inky clouds to really sell the effect. This is a great pairing with the already abstracted view of a side-scroller, and the result is, if nothing else, a very pretty game with the kind of art style that usually only an indie studio would commit to. The Chronicles games aren't technically 2D games, instead they're what they call 2.5D games, which means that while the games are mostly controlled like a traditional side-scroller, everything in-game is rendered in 3D, which can give the space a lot more dynamic range, and allows you to do things like move between planes by going forwards or backwards sometimes, a level of depth which is impossible in a traditional 2D rendered game. It's a pretty radical departure from the realistic like the main games aim for, but if you've already committed to a change in genre, then go all the way. If you're going to be a bear, be a grizzly. Art direction is by far the strongest aspect of the Chronicles games. Everything else? Well, the Chronicles games attempt to translate the ideas of the 3D games into a 2D plane, and the results are sometimes effective, but more often than not intensely frustrating, because stealth on a 2D plane is severely limited. The gameplay is much more gamified than the 3D games are out of necessity, with big and obvious vision cones for the enemies and distraction tools with a big and obvious radius. Because of the limitations of 2D, there is almost no room for player freedom and experimentation. Stealth in the Chronicles games is about doing the one thing that the game expects you to do, or screwing it up. This is a criticism people have made of some of the main games as well, but trust me when I say that Assassin's Creed 3 is as open and free as Elden Ring in comparison to the Chronicles games. You're encouraged to take a stealth approach by a rather unclear medal system. Each level in the game is split into a series of checkpoints, and after each checkpoint your performance through a part is graded either bronze, silver or gold against 3 separate playstyles: Shadow, Assassin or Brawler. This is where the confusion sets in. The Shadow playstyle means avoiding all of the enemies and moving without being seen, the Assassin playstyle means killing all of the enemies while avoiding being seen, and the Brawler playstyle means killing all of the enemies while being seen. So you're rewarded for committing to a certain playstyle, but the playstyles are not equal. A gold Shadow medal is worth significantly more than a gold Brawler medal. This system is broken. Pure and simple, it doesn't make any sense and it's implemented very weirdly. See, your final score at the end of the level has the potential to unlock things like health upgrades or increased inventory capacity, and you only get the higher upgrades by playing Shadow. But if you're playing Shadow, then you don't really need a health upgrade in the first place. You do, however, need a health upgrade to play the Brawler style, which you won't get by playing the Brawler style. The system is broken. There's never a reason to be aiming for anything but Shadow other than the fact that Shadow is really annoying to play. But you can't even start as a Shadow and then switch to Brawler if you mess it up, because then you're just going to get a Bronze Shadow or a Bronze Brawler. You have to commit to a playstyle from the beginning of the chapter. Having Brawler as one of the options doesn't make sense within the game, because the game is clearly set up as a stealth game first and foremost. Melee combat is a last resort, much more than it is in the 3D games, which makes it doubly strange that all of the tutorials by weird sounding Ezio are dedicated to melee combat, skills which you're actively not supposed to be using. This scoring system also works against the game's general art direction. It breaks the idea that you're playing through some sort of story being told with these obvious artificial gamey elements. And that's not even getting into the helix glitches, which allow you to do straight up magic thanks to the animus, some of which are required to pass through certain sections with a gold Shadow rating. There is no modern-day aspect to the Chronicles games aside from one cutscene at the very end and the framework of the Animus, but there's no context for why you're in the Animus, or why the memories are being presented as 2D side-scrollers rendered in a traditional Chinese art style. It doesn't need to be explained, obviously, but it's the first time in the series that the Animus actually serves to remove a level of immersion rather than add it. If any games in the series don't need the Animus, it's the Chronicles games. This whole scoring and playstyle system is built to increase replayability. There's multiple levels of New Game Plus with added difficulty and added rewards. The intended play of the game is to run these levels over and over again to try and get the best score possible, which makes all the lovely art and any story the game is trying to tell not much more than set dressing for a speedrunning game, something akin to Ubisoft's Trials franchise. This is why I call the games Wasteful, because Xiaojun has a lot of potential as a protagonist, and the game does have a good story, or at least the foundations of a good story, which probably would make for an amazing Assassin's Creed game if given the time to actually develop. Xiaojun's life is built on strife. She was born an imperial concubine, which is to say part of the emperor's personal harem, although the game does make it explicitly clear that she was not one of the sex ones, she was a dancer, which is also the explanation for why her feet were not bound, as would be common custom at the time. To a lot of women of the era, this would be considered a great honour, but Xiaojun never chose this life, she was forced into it. So when the assassins came to liberate the concubines, she jumped at the opportunity and immediately joined the assassins. That same mission that led Xiaojun to the assassins is also what eventually led to the Brotherhood's downfall, as it's when the 8 Tigers, who were controlled by the Templars, discovered the identity of the assassin leaders and later hunted them down and killed them. leading to where we find Xiaojun and Embers coming to Ezio desperate for support and training. None of this is actually shown in-game. This is all backstory delivered in hidden collectible scrolls found on each level, and that is such a waste because all of this is just the perfect setup for an Assassin's Creed game. Exploring a tumultuous period of history from a unique perspective is what the very best Assassin's Creed games are built on, and the perspective of a former Imperial concubine is something unique and different from any of the other Assassin's Creed games. In case it wasn't obvious from this whole setup, this was a time of tremendous gender inequality in China, and that plays into how Xiaojun fights and controls. That's why the shadow playstyle is the most natural fit for her, because being as she is in a public spotlight is pretty much impossible. And besides that, the 8 Tigers pretty much were real-life Templars, a group of powerful eunuchs who conspired to control the Emperor and the Empire as a whole amongst themselves. Chronicles China's short runtime and limited perspective can only possibly scratch the surface of what makes this time period and this conflict so interesting, especially when the narrative is such a small focus of the game. What does get the focus is Xiaojun's revenge plot, which even as a generic motivation has the potential to be a great anchor for a full game. It already has more to say about revenge than Assassin's Creed 2, relying on the old adage that they who seek revenge should first dig 2 graves. But Chronicles China does follow up on that. Xiaojun's quest for revenge is self-destructive. It leads to the burning of towns, the death of her mentor, and the betrayal of her friends. She is completely isolated by the end of the game, and it's only at that rock bottom that she begins to rebuild. Xiaojun's anger isn't hot either, it's cold, malicious anger, the kind that makes her targets suffer. She is a very dangerous woman. That could be the narrative anchor of a great 30-hour Assassin's Creed game, and instead it's the anchor of a weird little 3-hour arcade game that's over before it ever even really begins. It's a waste. Of course, there are other reasons we've never had a full Assassin's Creed game set in China, and I'm not just talking about the women don't sell nonsense, which was still in full swing at the time this game came out. China is a country that still exists, and China is very specific about the ways you're allowed to talk about China. This is fine for your little spin-off game, but you maybe don't want to piss off the Chinese government after spending millions of dollars developing a game set in their country. I'd imagine a similar thought process went into Chronicles Russia. It's a little reminder that history never stops happening, and our media and the stories we tell are ultimately shaped by the world around us, and the political landscape they were created in.
Security's tight today. Someone must have noticed my visits. I don't need weapons to knock out a few guards, but better not give them a reason to shoot me. There it is. Now to reach it. Unarmed and in areas I shouldn't be, full of palace guards. This is going to be fun.
The second episode of Chronicles is Chronicles India, and it is in my opinion the weakest of the 3 games. Part of that is just that it suffers from middle child syndrome. It feels like the least important, squished in the middle, but mainly it has the most forgettable story and the weakest art direction. Chronicles India stars Arbaz Mir and one of his adventures during the Anglo-Sikh Wars. Like Xiaojun, he is also a character from the extended Assassin's Creed canon. Arbaz first appeared in a graphic novel called Brahmin back in 2013. And he also happens to be the dad of Henry Green from Assassin's Creed Syndicate. In some ways, this actually makes him an even weirder choice of protagonist than Xiaojun because the important parts of his life were already covered in his debut graphic novel. So then this game is just a "and then this happened" story about a separate adventure he went on after all the important stuff happened, and it feels that way. The connective tissue between all 3 games is the precursor box that Ezio gave to Xiaojun at the end of Embers, the same box that Shea was after in Rogue. They never explicitly call it as such, but it's basically Pandora's box. It's a box full of nebulous magic. Sometimes it tells you where the earthquake machines are, sometimes, like in this game, it powers other ancient artifacts. The Chronicles games are in fact the chronicles of the continuing journey of the magic box. Xiaojun lost the box to the Templars, so now it's Arbaz's job to try and get it back. The thing that sets India apart from the other games is that China and Russia have a narrative beyond the box drama, and India really doesn't. The magic box makes up the entire drive of the narrative, that and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which is an equally nebulous MacGuffin. I mean, it's a real thing that exists, but within the story of the game it's another artifact on the same level as the box. This choice to focus exclusively on the box drama serves to rob Chronicles India of its own distinct identity within the sub-series. That's not to say there's nothing unique about it. It does change some things around from China, some changes are even improvements, but it's possibly even more than Chronicles China a waste of its setting. One change that is definitely for the better is the improvements to the medal system. The confusing brawler playstyle has been replaced by a playstyle that makes a lot more sense: Silencer. As established back in Syndicate, the Indian Brotherhood prefers a non-lethal approach when possible, so this game adds new non-lethal takedowns to your arsenal, which is what the Silencer playstyle revolves around. It's still better to aim for Shadow, but the game has also implemented a multiplier that increases your score with each gold medal you get, regardless of what kind of medal it is. So there is less punishment for switching up your playstyle when you deem it necessary. India is much more committed to being a full stealth game because of this change, and it feels much better to play because of it. It doesn't solve my fundamental immersion problems with all the levels being graded at the end, but at least it makes the system a lot smoother. I said the art style was the weakest in the trilogy, and that doesn't mean it's bad, it's just much less striking than the other two games. It switches from China's ink wash to a hand-drawn illustration with a lot more colour to it. It still looks nice, but it's also a lot less distinct because hand illustration is a style that plenty of other games have done before. Within the Chronicles series, it's the colourful one, but in the wider gaming landscape, that makes it less interesting. The main thing it has going for it are these abstract patterns and colours that make up the background, and the cutscene illustrations that look very nice. If the whole game had leaned more into this style, it would be a lot more distinct. Of course, in the face of what you do in the game and the focus on the magic box drama, any distinctiveness that the art style could have is robbed by the fact that you spend about a third of the game in precursor temples, which carry over their look of weird grey sci-fi boxes and lights from the previous games. And jumping around in them could easily be confused for any generic platformer in the last decade because absolutely nothing about them screams India. Arbaz himself is also quite generic as far as protagonists go, at least as he's portrayed in this game. He's basically just an Indian Ezio, a quippy, cocky ladies' man. And it really is a shame that the game is like this, because I cannot stress enough how great a setting this would be for a full Assassin's Creed game. Equally as expansive with potential as Chronicles China. The Anglo-Sikh Wars were extremely messy conflicts which shaped the landscape of India as we know it today. Their place in the Assassin-Templar conflict is something that is prime for an Assassin's Creed story. But in Chronicles India, the war is nothing more than a backdrop to the story about chasing down a magic box. India is a massive country with dozens of distinct cultures and thousands of years of history, just like China is, and the fact that Chronicles India is the franchise's only visit to the country is just as annoying. The choice of Templars makes perfect sense, as William Sleeman is a personification of colonial power in India already. He's a natural fit for Templar Grandmaster. But the game can only give the vaguest overviews on colonialism in India, again because of the game's short runtime, and also because we're spending most of our time chasing a magic box. Ultimately, Chronicles India is less than the sum of its parts, and it was already starting from the place of a fairly generic side-scroller. And that, unfortunately, makes it the most forgettable of the three Chronicles games, which are already starting from the basis of being forgettable.
Nikolai, how long has it been? You have worked for me. Always the charmer. But I'm glad it is you this sense. I have a dangerous assignment.
What certainly doesn't help India on the forgettable scale was its release window. There was an 8-month gap between China and India, but then only 1 month between India and the final game in the trilogy, Chronicles Russia. A real just getting over with feeling move. However, despite how it sounds, Chronicles Russia is easily the best of the three Chronicles games and the only one in the trilogy that I actually think is worth playing outside of just being a completionist. It's still fundamentally the same game as the other two, with the same problems, but it's the game that pushes the format the most, and the only one that I think really justifies its genre as being a better fit than a traditional Assassin's Creed game would be. Chronicles Russia stars Nikolai Orlov, a super important assassin from several graphic novels because he's the great-grandfather of Daniel Cross, the evil Desmond in Assassin's Creed 3. That's why he randomly starts speaking Russian in that one scene. Of the three Chronicles protagonists, he's easily my favourite because he's not at all what you'd expect from a gruff and rugged Russian revolutionary. He's surprisingly soft-spoken and has a tired world weariness to him. He's done with Russia, he's ready to run away, and considering the political climate at the time, that's a pretty understandable impulse. But he's got one job left before he can do that. Chronicles Russia also has by far my favourite art style of the three games. It's all based on Soviet propaganda of the era, which gives it such a stark and compelling look. All of the buildings are monochrome whites and greys, contrasted against these bright red abstract skylines and the small pops of colour from interiors. Unfortunately, YouTube compression is probably going to murder it because of that, but it's such an interesting style that's distinct from really anything else I've played, and gives the game such an overwhelming, oppressive atmosphere. It's an art style that actually works to enhance the game over a traditional open-world approach. By 1918, the world just isn't built for an Assassin's Creed game anymore. Syndicate was already running up against that boundary. So this abstraction is actually more visually interesting than the grey industrial look that a realistic game would have to go for. The plot of the game is centred around a pivotal moment in the Russian Revolution, the murder of the last Tsar and his family, an event which would go on to be a very important step in the Bolshevik rise to power, and was also just not a very cool moment in history, because murdering children, some as young as 13, just isn't a very nice thing to do, in my opinion, even if they are royals. Specifically, though, the plot of the game centres around a famous real historical mystery, or I suppose technically a fake historical mystery, the reported survival of Nicholas II's youngest daughter, Anastasia, a classic conspiracy theory that's a perfect fit for the Assassin's Creed series. For nearly 70 years, a woman called Anna Anderson claimed to be the lost princess, even went to court to argue her claims, which ended inconclusively. It wasn't until 2006, when the grave of the actual Anastasia was found, that her claims were officially debunked. And of course, with a conspiracy this old, that evidence has its detractors. Chronicles Russia assumes that Anna Anderson was in fact the real Anastasia. Nikolai enters the home of the Tsar on the night of their execution looking for the magic box, and he finds it clutched in the hands of Anastasia. What happens next is where things get weird, in a good way. When the box touches a necklace that Nikolai is wearing, itself another piece of Eden from one of his prior adventures, the box does something to Anastasia. It gives her all of the memories of the legendary assassin Xiao Jun, which instantly gives Anastasia the skills of one of the most dangerous women who ever lived. This is yet another tick against India, unfortunately. Russia's story directly ties back to Chronicles China, where India has no connection at all besides the presence of the box. It also leads into the secret second protagonist of the game, with Anastasia having several of her own levels with a different toolkit from Nikolai and a different approach, making her, I believe, the first real-life historical figure to be playable in the series. She doesn't have access to any of Nikolai's gadgets and is completely unable to fight in melee combat. She's also not able to perform non-lethal takedowns. It's all or nothing since she's only armed with a knife, that a certain malevolent spirit inside of her knows exactly what to do with. To compensate for this, the game finally does something artistically interesting with the hacking superpowers, because in Chronicles Russia, only Anya can use them. Which, even if it still feels a bit weird, does add to the perception that her newfound abilities are supernatural in nature. Xiao Jun might seem like an odd choice as an evil spirit, but it makes sense when you remember that her memories were imprinted on this box at the start of her journey, not the end. This is the Xiao Jun full of vengeance and cold rage, feelings which Anya, having just witnessed the brutal murder of her family, has a lot of sympathy with. Nikolai agrees to protect Anastasia and escort her back to the assassins in Moscow, who he assumes will be able to help her with this whole Xiao Jun business. And this makes up the structure of the game. A long journey is the perfect structure for a side-scroller where you're always moving in one direction. Thus, it's the game with the most consistency between story and presentation. It's also the game that's the most experimental within the story of the Assassin's Creed games, because the game has little to no Templar influence at all. There are some implications that the Templars are working behind the scenes, but for the most part you're fighting, or more accurately hiding, from the Bolsheviks. This puts Nikolai in an interesting position, because the assassins are broadly supportive of the revolution. Nikolai is even personal friends with Leon Trotsky. But there is, of course, a big difference between the stated ideals of the Russian Revolution and the actual outcomes of the Russian Revolution. In 1918, we're not quite there yet, but the murder of the Tsar's family is a pretty good indication of where things are going. Anastasia is a child, but she is a politically dangerous child. Dangerous to the political ambitions of the Bolsheviks, so they want her dead. And as a father himself, that's not something Nikolai can ever get behind, regardless of political beliefs. The rest of the assassins don't have such hang-ups. Once they get back to Moscow, Anya is squirreled away somewhere, and Nikolai overhears that they're planning a procedure to extract Xiao Jun, which will probably end up killing Anya in the process. So, he turns against his own brothers to rescue her. It's probably for the best that this game was so obscure, because otherwise I think there might be some accusations of plagiarism.
This bracelet bears the initials of all of us. It's mine to wear now. The last of us.
Yeah, Anastasia, I got it. The details are obviously different, but the broad strokes of Chronicles Russia are shockingly similar to The Last of Us. A gruff older dad figure protecting a magical special daughter figure trying to escort her across a dangerous environment, culminating in a third act twist where you have to charge a path of destruction through your allies to save her from a dodgy experiment. I don't really have a point to be made with this comparison other than the fact that it's shockingly blatant and you can't not notice while playing. For what it's worth, I think Chronicles Russia does a much better job with its evil assassins than either Rogue or Unity ever managed, because they're ideologically consistent evil assassins, which is a lot more interesting. They support freedom, they broadly support the ideas of the revolution, so yeah, they don't really care about the life of some princess. They don't actively want her dead, but they're not going to cry many tears if she ends up that way.
The girl is now secure down there. Feisty little bitch. She bit me.
She's down in the facility, where they run the tests.
Who knows exactly what they do, but it usually doesn't end well for the patient.
At least the last Romanov will soon be gone. Russia can start anew.
I am not kidding when I say this background conversation is more interesting and thought-provoking than anything in all of Assassin's Creed Unity. It's the banality of evil. These guys aren't cartoon villains, and they can even see on some level that what they're doing isn't a good thing. They just don't really care. And that's how it starts. That impulse to excuse atrocities is how your movement starts shifting from a pro-social revolution to a totalitarian state of violence. If you keep excusing the atrocities, eventually the atrocities are all that's left. Apathy is the most dangerous political movement that there is. So far, I've been pretty positive on Chronicles Russia considering, so let's temper that with reality. Chronicles Russia is still not a great game. Its failings are all just on the actual video game playing side of things. Chronicles Russia is by far the hardest game in the trilogy, and not in a way that feels intentional, in a way that feels not properly playtested. Anya's missions especially have a lot of instant fail stealth sections that require absolute perfect timing to pull off, which is never a fun thing to play through. And the tank escape sequence in the final mission is so finely tuned that if you mess up a single jump then you've botched the whole run, because there is absolutely no margin for error whatsoever. Just like for the other two games, it suffers from far too short a runtime. Even if the format works, it could do with being much longer to let the relationship between Nikolai and Anya develop at a more natural pace. And for as cool an idea the evil spirit Xiaojun is, she doesn't actually have all that much of an impact on the story. Chronicles Russia just feels rushed, like they've just wanted to get it out and done with because the Chronicles series had already been written off as a failed experiment, which I do not necessarily disagree with, but it still feels like a waste when Chronicles Russia had the potential to be something really interesting. The Chronicles games are short, messy, and ultimately just not very good, but that doesn't mean they deserve to be forgotten and ignored. If anything, because of those reasons, but also because, at the very least, they are quite pretty. If we're never going to get a real game with Xiaojun, or Arbazmir, or Nikolai Orlov, then we should at least remember the weird little spin-off games that they did get. There are some franchises that can cross genres. Halo, for example, made a successful jump from FPS to RTS. But I don't think Assassin's Creed is one of those franchises, at least the Chronicles games have not convinced me that it is. The Assassin's Creed games can change a lot, but at their foundation they are, and always will be, I think, third-person adventure games. That is their place, that is where they feel best, that is where they are able to do the most with their premise of exploring history. Even if the Chronicles games were amazing, they were never going to be able to do that on the same scale. But hey, you don't know until you try, do you? If there's one thing that massive franchises are great for, it's the breathing room to do weird little experiments like the Chronicles games, and I admire that if absolutely nothing else. I would still like a real Xiaojun game though, please.
Master Berg! Is this it? The precursor box?
Delivered as ordered, Master Grammatica.
Curious little item, isn't it?
What do you plan to do with it?
I'm hoping it will help me better understand another artifact we have uncovered.
What kind of research are you doing here?
Project Phoenix, Master Berg. Project Phoenix!
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here, or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up, it would mean a lot to me. As well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell so that YouTube tells you the things that you tell it you want to be told, but then it just decides not to. So hit the bell multiple times until you're properly sure that it's doing the things it's supposed to do. If you want to see my entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click this playlist up here, or for something a bit different, here's a video about how a Star Trek short film ruined my life.